So that's a perfect segue to my introduction to tonight's speaker, who is also speaking at the forum, Professor Toby Walsh. Welcome, Toby. Toby is Scientia Professor of Artificial Intelligence School of Computer Science and Engineering at the University of New South Wales. He needs no introduction. I think his picture here tells 1,000 stories. He's not only a serious science with deep knowledge in the field of artificial intelligence, but he's been named by the Australian newspaper as one of the rock stars of Australia's digital revolution. He's the recipient of the New South Wales Premier's Prize for Excellence in Engineering and ICT. He's familiar to you as someone who appears regularly on TV and radio, and he's also authored 2 books on artificial intelligence for a general audience, the most recent being entitled 2062, The World That AI Made. So Toby, welcome, and I hand over to you.
Hello. Let me begin by paying my respects to the original owners of the land upon which I sit, the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and extend those respects to all Aboriginal owners, past, present, and emerging. I'm going to talk today about artificial intelligence and how it's starting to impact upon our privacy and our identity. Often when I talk about artificial intelligence, in fact, almost invariably whenever I talk about artificial intelligence in the media, they put up a picture of Terminator. I want to convince you that the risks and the benefits of artificial intelligence are much simpler and much nearer. And I wanted to illustrate that by 2 very recent stories that have appeared in the press. The first is about this new COVID home quarantine app that's being trialled, first of all in South Australia, but now in many of the states. And secondly, a story about a Queensland trial of a tool to predict and prevent domestic violence. But let me begin with the first. There's an app being trialled that uses face recognition software and GPS to monitor people undertaking home quarantine. Now, let me begin by saying I'm very keen that we open back our borders and do so in a safe way. But I find myself in a rather unusual situation, which is agreeing with news organizations like Fox News and Breitbart, who have described this as Orwellian. In general, I'm very concerned about the increasing use of facial recognition software within our lives. This isn't a concern that just I have, many of my colleagues do, but we saw recently the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights called for a moratorium on many uses of facial recognition. We've seen the Australian Human Rights Commissioner, just retired, Ed Santow, also call for a moratorium on many uses of facial recognition in high-stakes settings. There's many reasons to be concerned. Facial recognition software is a technology where it's troubling if it works. It allows us to scale surveillance in a way that we've never been able to scale. And it's troubling, as I will talk about, when it doesn't work. And there are many harms that will be committed by the fact that the software doesn't work very well for all types of people. If we want to see where this might take us, we only have to look outside our own borders to China, where we're already seeing some very troubling examples of how facial recognition software is starting to be used. In China, there's a system ominously called Skynet. Skynet, let me remind you, is the troubling AI computer system in the Terminator movies. And that is able to scan cameras and use facial recognition to scan a billion faces in a second. And as an example of the new things that allows you to do, there was a recent story of how the Chinese police were able to identify a wanted felon at a rock concert that had 60,000 people in it. That's something that human eyes can't do. A human can't look in a crowd of 60,000 people and pick out an individual face. But that's something that computer eyes can do. That takes us to a new and troubling place. It used to be if you went on a demonstration, if you went and protested about, I don't know, Black Lives Mattering or the climate emergency, you were essentially anonymous. But now we have the technology to identify who you are. And we saw that not so long ago in the democracy protests in Hong Kong, when the protesters invaded Hong Kong airport. What was the first thing that the protesters did? They took down the cameras. That was the greatest threat to their ability to protest and call for change. There are many reasons, technical reasons, to be concerned about facial recognition. I mentioned that often it doesn't work. And one of the great concerns is the gender and racial and other biases that can often be found in facial recognition software. This has been well known. This has been well documented for many years. And the big tech companies who are developing tools in this space, companies like Amazon, have been putting a lot of effort into trying to eliminate such biases, but have failed. And it's still with regular numbing frequency. We see news reports of another study done to show that the tools maintain their biases. But ultimately, there's a bigger, deeper problem here. Many people believe that we've given up our digital privacy, that we've given away too much of our digital data to the tech companies, that when we're online, we're constantly being surveilled, we're leaving a digital trail behind us. But we may end up also giving away our analog privacy. What do I mean by our analog privacy? Our faces, our geolocation, our heartbeat, our blood pressure, we're increasingly being monitored out there in the analog physical world, not in the digital world, but in the physical world. Our photograph, our face is being photographed by cameras in shopping centres, and we're increasingly connecting devices to ourselves, smartwatches that are monitoring our heartbeat, our blood pressure, our vital signs. This is in some sense more troubling than our digital presence. You can lie about your digital presence. You can lie about your digital preferences. You can hide behind VPNs. You can disguise what you do and what you like in many ways digitally. But it's much more difficult, indeed, in some cases impossible, to hide your analog information. You can't completely hide your face. You can't lie about your heartbeat. And that will provide tools of amazing power and capability. Imagine what it would be like if politicians in real time could track the heartbeats of the people listening to their speeches. And I wanted to use the second story, this story about Queensland Police trialling an AI tool designed to predict and prevent domestic violence incidents. Of course, domestic violence is a terrible stain on Australian society. In excess of one woman a week is murdered by their partner. That's clearly a great social problem that we need to address. And if we had good tools, good AI tools that could help us deal with that, what could be wrong with that? This takes us into an area called predictive policing. We have, after all, a lot of historical data about crime, about where crime took place and when crime took place. And possibly we could use that data to make predictions. We have limited amounts of resources, police resources, to go and monitor what's going on. If we could predict where crime might take place, then we could better target those limited resources to the most likely places. There are many challenging issues that these sorts of ideas throw up. And again, we only have to look to overseas to understand what some of the risks, what some of the difficulties might be. If we look to the United States, there is already a tool being used that is often brought out as it illustrates many of the challenges. It's a tool called Compass. It's developed to help judges in the United States, in 20 of the 52 states of the United States, decide sentencing decisions. It is a tool that tries to predict the probability that a person facing trial is likely to commit another offence, and therefore whether you can safely release them on bail or not. It sounds a good idea to make more evidence-based decisions about bail, but analysis of how the tool works has shown some troubling biases in the tool, that it is rather racially biased. It's more likely to say that white people who will go on to recommit violent offences won't, and it's more likely to say that black people who won't go on to recommit violent offences will. And it's worth looking at the tool itself. The tool is based upon a survey that the person completes. You have to answer about 100 odd questions, and it's worth looking at what these questions are. Here's one of the questions. About at what age you were when your parents divorced. This is a troubling question. It's mixing up correlation with causation. It might be that people who come from broken homes, people whose parents divorce at an early age, end up committing more crimes. But we don't want to be assuming that it's the cause of that and prosecuting people then just because they had the misfortune to come from a broken home. Another of the questions is how often you've moved around in the last few months. And I must admit, guilt in this respect. I have moved frequently in the last few months. But again, do we want to be prosecuting people because their landlord happened to have sold their apartment recently? Is that a reason to be locking people up? And a third question, again, I must admit guilt to this question. How often do you feel bored? Presumably bored people are more likely to commit crime, but should we be prosecuting boredom? Putting those concerns aside, there are many other reasons to be concerned about the use of such tools. The tool itself is not actually particularly accurate, and it's actually very easy to do better or as well in much simpler ways. Some researchers have shown that if you just ask random people, just give people a few sentences description of the defendant, pay them $1 and use a tool for crowdsourcing this called Mechanical Turk, you can get just as accurate predictions. And another way of getting just as accurate predictions, much simpler and arguably much fairer, instead of using those 100 data points they used from that questionnaire, was to use just 2 data points. The age of the person and the number of priors that the person had. You could get just an accurate prediction, presumably without all the racial biases, as that 100 question questionnaire that was used. And just to explain the troubles, the errors in the predictions it makes, these bar graphs give you a very good idea. So on the far left, you see the overall accuracy. It's broken down into what humans previously had done and what Compass, the computerized tool, did. And it's broken out into the decisions, the accuracy are for black defendants and the accuracy for white defendants. And you see the accuracy, overall accuracy, around about 67%, 2/3, is very similar, both for the human-made decisions and the computer-made decisions, and it's very similar for the two groups, black people and white people. And this was the reason on which North Point, the developers of this tool, Compass, defended the use of this tool. And indeed, the tool is strangely still in use, in wide use in the United States. But when you break out the errors, as I've done in the two right bar charts, you see the errors are very racially biased. The errors are disproportionately falling against black people and in favor of white people. So if you look at the false positives, the people that are falsely predicted to go on and reoffend who don't, you see the errors are much greater in black people than white people, and the computer system Compass does worse job again than humans making those decisions. And then if you look at the right-hand bar chart, the false negatives, that is the people who are predicted not to reoffend and so perhaps released on bail, who do indeed go on to reoffend whilst they're out of bail. Again, we see a racial bias in favour of white people, that there are many more false positives for white people these are in some sense the real cost on society. The people who are released into society go on to commit further offences. And we see again that, people are racially biased. That's worth pointing out, of course, that humans aren't particularly good at making these decisions, but the computer is even worse. The computer makes even more racially biased decisions than humans do. So the promise that we were given in many settings that computers could make less bias, wouldn't suffer all our subconscious biases, is clearly demonstrated to be false here. The computer is actually making far worse decisions. And that's despite the developers of this trying very hard. I mean, for example, they didn't include race as one of the inputs. It was very obvious if you did, the system would learn the racial biases of the past. And so they deliberately did not include race as one of those 100 questions. But there were other questions. I mean, one of the other inputs was zip code, postcode. And as you are probably well aware, in many parts of the United States, postcode is a good proxy for race. There are black neighborhoods and white neighborhoods, and the system would very quickly learn that. So not including race as one of the inputs didn't stop the system learning proxies for race that it was then able to discriminate on. But there's a deeper, more fundamental problem with things like predictive policing. And that applies to predictive policing, but it applies to AI that's being used in many other settings. AI that's being used to set insurance rates, AI that's being used to decide who gets healthcare or who gets welfare. And that, by its very nature, it's trained on historical data. We have historical data about where crime took place. And that historical data reflects the biases of the system in which it was collected. Maybe if we had more police patrols in poorer, blacker neighbourhoods, and therefore more poor black people were caught committing crime. And so by basing it on historical data, we're inevitably baking in the biases of the past, unless we're very careful. But there's actually an even more fundamental, deeper problem here. And again, this applies to many other settings like insurance and health and welfare and other places where we're handing decisions over to machines, is that we don't actually have the statistic that we're trying to predict. We don't know where crime took place. And it's not clear that we would ever have that statistic. We have a proxy for it, where crime took place, where we've caught the criminals and prosecuted them. We have that data. But there was probably lots of crime that took place that we never saw, that we will never be able to know about. And so frequently in these settings, we don't have a proxy. So I am greatly concerned that there is a real challenge here of dealing with domestic violence. But if we hand the decision-making over to machines, we may end up perpetuating the biases of the past. And we've already seen some troubling examples of that within Australia itself. Many of you will be aware of the robo-debt problem, where demands for welfare payment refunds were sent out in a completely automated fashion. And it highlights what the government actually was advised before they implemented the system, which was that you should very carefully remove humans completely from the decision-making loop. These letters were sent out without any human oversight, and the government was warned, in fact, that the system would make errors and that perhaps humans should be kept in the loop to ensure the sanity of the decisions being sent out. That wasn't done, and great harm was caused as a consequence. So I hope I've illustrated that there are a lot of problems, and there are undoubtedly many different solutions. There are technical issues that we can look at, but the solutions go beyond just technology. They go ultimately to what sort of society we want to be. They are political, economic, and societal problems as much as they are technological problems. And the technology, in some sense, just illustrates long-standing problems that we haven't perhaps necessarily addressed very well in the past, but made them very stark, because once we write computer programs, we have to be very precise about the decisions, the trade-offs that we're making within our society. So if there are many problems, what do we need? Well, of course, we do need more research. There are technical fixes to some of these issues. We can, if we identify that there are particular biases, racial or gender biases, within our systems, we can try and build in ways of trying to de-bias them once we've identified that those biases exist. So there's plentiful research, and indeed I've been just lucky enough to win a laureate fellowship to spend the next 5 years looking at sorts of issues. How can we, what do we mean mathematically for a system to be fair? And then how do we build algorithms that respect those properties of fairness? But as I said, the issues go beyond that. These are issues that touch all of society, and therefore all of society needs to be involved. And therefore it's very important that we have a public debate about what should it be? What measure of fairness should we be striving for when we build these systems? Of course, if we're going to have public debate, that needs to be informed. And so it's really important that we have education. The whole public needs to understand the benefits as well as the limitations of these technologies, and so that they can contribute to those debates in useful, meaningful ways. And finally, and I've hinted at this in various places, we will ultimately also need more regulation. There will be policy needed in place. There are decisions where we cannot let the market alone decide. If, for example, we're building systems that decide insurance rates, we have to decide as a society what we need. So, for example, in the European Union, it's now been decided that decision-making software that's being used to set insurance rates, whether they be health insurance, life insurance, car insurance, has to be blind to gender. Men and women have to be offered the same prices. Those have interesting consequences. Men and women now have the same insurance rates for car insurance. Women's car insurance rates therefore went up. Statistically, women are much better drivers than men. Women have far fewer accidents. But now women are subsidizing men's bad driving. That was a societal decision implemented by policy. We have to face up to these sorts of difficult, challenging decisions ourselves. If you want to know more, I encourage you to take a look at my latest book, 2062, The World That AI Made, that looks at many of these challenging issues and discusses where AI may take us in the next 40 or 50 years to 2062, when many of my colleagues have predicted machines will be as smart as us. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Toby, and congratulations on your laureate fellowship. It's extraordinarily heartening to have such a distinguished AI scholar working on fairness. As a philosopher, I'm really delighted that you think it's good that people are doing philosophy. So I've very much enjoyed your approach to these questions. I want to begin with questions around what you call privacy and I call privacy. I checked with Oxford and both are acceptable, so there we go. Your examples this evening cite the dangers of facial recognition, scaled surveillance, predictive policing, They're very, very chilling. Both of these are invasions of privacy with government at work. I know you've talked a great deal elsewhere, and I do commend to everybody your book. It's fantastic. About invasions of privacy due to corporations. We're terribly aware that Facebook, that the great tech companies, Google, are free because they sell our data, the consumers' data, to advertisers. Now, to some extent, that's already worrying. It's worrying because our data is being accumulated and brought together and worked on by artificial intelligence to such an extent that those companies know more about our own beliefs and desires than we do ourselves. They can see great generalizations and understand things about ourselves that we might not be able to introspect. But it's dangerous to, and as you know, the Cambridge Analytica crisis reminded us that with that predictive ability, you can also nudge and push people to vote. I think particularly of Shoshana Zuboff here, where she argues that it's the fact that it's capital, that it's a capitalist project that's the worry. So do you think the dangers of artificial intelligence in corporate hands is worse or better than the dangers when it's in the hands of the state?
That is a great question. I think your concerns have some substance, that corporations are less accountable than governments. I mean, we have to re-elect governments. They have to gain our popular support every now and again. Corporations are not answerable. And indeed, I think many of the troubles we've been seeing over the last half a dozen years can be led back to the fact that corporations are now as powerful as countries in many respects. I mean, a company like Google or Facebook has the capitalization of a small nation. It is worth as much as Luxembourg. And they work across national borders. They don't, national laws don't seem to apply so well to them. They don't pay tax in many places. And there is a value alignment problem here. I mean, we talk about value alignment in artificial intelligence, about are the values of the computer aligned with those of humans, but we have a real value alignment problem in capitalism, that the values of corporations are not aligned with those of the society in which they're operating. And indeed, it's not clear that they're aligned with the values of the shareholders, and they do things that benefit perhaps the stockholders, the stock options of the CEO more than anyone else. Yes, I think we should be very concerned that this data is being collected by private corporations, some of which, as I talk about in the book, have very novel share structures, which mean they're even less answerable than old-fashioned corporations. And then I think what you hint at in the second part of your question, the most dangerous part is that we've discovered that humans can be hacked. The human mind is susceptible to being to do things that are not necessarily in our best interests. And I mean, the whole advertising industry is predicated on this idea. And in the past, it wasn't too troubling. The fact that whether we were going to buy Omo or Daz wasn't too important. We were going to buy some washing powder, and which brand, it wasn't really going to have too significant impact on the world. Advertising could push us to buy one or the other, not necessarily the best brand. But now those brands are who are our politicians, and very significant parts of our society are being decided by very powerful people. And I do find it strange. We have very strict rules about old-fashioned media. In most countries, there are strict rules about the amount of money you can spend on persuading people to vote for you, for good reason, because we know that people can be persuaded. We don't want the media barons or the people with the most money to be able to decide the outcomes. We want the people with the best ideas and the most democratic support. And yet we have this new thing, social media, which it should be a clue. It's in the name. It is a form of media. And indeed, when it's powered by artificial intelligence, is more powerful in many respects than old-fashioned media, because it can be highly personalized. In the past, you had to broadcast your messages. You had to say the same messages to everyone, and everyone could see whether they were true or false. Well, now we see individual messages, and we can. It's narrowcast to particular things, and people may be told untruths that we never see. I think people are quite surprised to discover that the internet that you see is unique to you. It's the internet that Google and Facebook and Amazon want you to see based upon the information, the preferences, the things that they've learned about you. And the internet that I see is completely different to the internet that you see.
Yes, now that's very interesting. And to some extent, that's where I wanted to ask a second question in this area. It's about identity, our sense of agency, our sense of feeling that we're making our choices, our privileged access to our own beliefs and desires is very much part of how we feel about our identity. And the question really is, to what extent is that sense of identity at risk? I really am interested in your distinction between digital privacy and what you call analog privacy. I hadn't ever thought of it like that before, but you say, yeah, we've lost the battle on digital privacy. We've lost. But the analog privacy, that sense of us as embodied people making choices, is that at risk? And if so, what can we do about it?
I think that is a real risk. Indeed, it's one of the things I'm most fearful about it at the moment, in some sense. Maybe, as you said, we've probably lost the digital privacy. We've given too much data away to those corporations, and we can't undo all of that information that we've given away. But the digital world, in some sense, is an easier place to hide. You can hide behind VPN. You can lie about your digital preferences. There's lots of things you can do to protect your identity in the digital space, but there's much less you can do in the analog, physical, real world. You only get one face, and you can't really hide. You can wear a mask, as all of us should be doing these days, but even so, you can still be recognized from your eyes, and face recognition can still recognize you. And we're connecting all these devices to ourselves, Fitbits and smartwatches that monitor our vital signs, our heartbeat, our blood pressure. And I do paint a chilling picture, I think, in the book, which is just imagine in the wrong hands what you could do if politicians could see in real time how people's heartbeats, which you can't hide what your true heartbeat is. If politicians could see people's heartbeats and how they responded, or how your eyes dilated in excitement or disgust to a particular idea that they were proposing to you. And so we are, and it's also worth mentioning the digital and the analog world are merging into one, and it's hard sometimes to distinguish between the two. But I do fear that we will end up in a world where it's not just our digital presence and our digital footprint that is one that's being tracked, but it's our analog, our footprint in the real world, that we're being surveilled by facial recognition 24/7 every time we step out. And that will completely change. It used to be, if you went on a demonstration and complained about Black Lives Mattering or the climate emergency or the many troubling things in our world today, you were essentially anonymous. But now you're not. We have the technology to be able to identify who you are. And there was a chilling example of what the technology could do, and we only have to sadly look to China to see that. There was an example 2 years ago where the Chinese police identified a wanted felon in a rock concert of 60,000 people. And that's taking us to a new place. Human eyes couldn't do that. You can't pick out a person you want in a crowd of 60,000 people. But computer eyes can do that. And so that does take us to the world that authors like Orwell and Huxley have warned us about. And I do say, Orwell got one thing wrong. It's not Big Brother. It's not people watching people. We saw the limits of that in East Germany. It's much more pervasive when you have computers watching people, because you literally can surveil a whole nation. And China now has a system that is able to surveil a whole nation, can scan 1 billion faces in a second.
Right. Well, in fact, that leads again to my next question. Thinking about privacy, I was recall, and this does date me, Stanley Benn talking in the 80s when these issues of privacy were disconnected from anything in the technological world. And he used to argue that the importance of privacy was linked to the importance of intimacy, that privacy, intimacy, and self-fulfillment were closely tied together. So my question now is, do you think that algorithms which can intervene, perhaps become intimate friends, perhaps are these people going to put in danger that sense of human fulfillment, or do you think they might be an opportunity?
It is a challenging and difficult question. There is a limit to how much social intimacy we can have. There's a wonderful idea, Dunbar's number. Dunbar came up with this idea that there's a limited number of social contacts we can have, and so it's the order of 200 to 500 people that you can know well. You can know their name and have a social interest in. Which is why, actually, I mean, it's interesting, and that's reflected in human society. So if you look at Oxbridge colleges or schools or monasteries, they all were a maximum of that size, because that's the maximum number of people you can know. That's and companies as well. Companies, when they get bigger than 500 people, then you stop being able to know everyone in that organization, and that itself introduces fresh problems. So if some of that bandwidth is being used by computers, and we are going to have increasingly more intimate relationships in some respects with computers, because they are going to know us better than we know each other. We spend more and more time connecting, interfacing with these devices, and they're becoming increasingly our personal assistants. They will know. Just like there's a lovely quote from Val Harrion, the chief economist of Google, which is, if you want to know what the future looks like, look at what rich people have today. Rich people have personal assistants who book them a hairdresser or manage their diary and take their cleaning to the dry cleaners and things like this. And so increasingly we're going to have digital assistants that do that. Rich people have chauffeurs, and increasingly we're going to have self-driving cars that are chauffeured for us. Rich people have personal bankers, and increasingly we're going to have robo-bankers that do that for us. So increasingly we are going to have our own personal assistants. The computer is going to become a personal assistant and is going to know everything about us. And so we're going to develop more and more, spend more and more time interacting with them. And it's easy to see that those relationships could become quite intimate. And there's, if you ask AI researchers, what Hollywood movies they like, most of them we dislike, but there's one, and it goes to this question of our relationship with the machines. The one I think that's really good, because it really does capture the future, which is the movie Her, which is all about a man's relationship with his digital assistant. And interestingly enough, it's the only movie in which the female lead was nominated for an Oscar despite never actually appearing. It was only her voice. But we will have these increasingly intimate relationships, and the question is, will that consume the air of our bandwidth to have relationships with other people?
Yes, I was just thinking that Ian McEwan's book, Machines Like Me, and then the new Kazuo Ishiguro are actually spelling out how that intimacy plays out. But moving on to regulation, and I think you're an overall optimist, you say, and you argue strong regulation. I think that's right. And I'm thinking of the European data protection laws, the GDPR. Now, in many ways, they're very verbose, very European, go on forever. They're strong, and one can understand where they're coming from philosophically. Probably trace them back to Descartes. But I went to a session at IBM where people who are interested in free trade in services were apoplectic about the GDPR. The problem, they said, was that in order to trade into Europe, you've got to be GDPR compliant. And if you've got servers elsewhere in the world, they've got to be GDPR compliant. And the argument was that this was a restrictive trade practice. So I wonder what you think about GDPR and whether it's going to be possible to get the regulation right.
Just to say, yes, I am an optimist in the long term, but I'm somewhat pessimistic in the short term. I think it's a rather bumpy road the next decade or two that we're going through. We face a tsunami of problems, and we still got to get out of the pandemic. We have, the greatest existential threat to humanity is the climate emergency that we still struggling to adjust to. Plus, all of the disruptions that technology, like artificial intelligence, are bringing into our lives. But equally, those technologies, I think, are our savior. The only reason that we've got through the problems of the past is because we've embraced the benefits that technology come, and we're not going to be able to deal with the climate emergency now. We're not going to be able to deal with the increasing inequality in our society and the increasing population of the planet unless we embrace everything that technologies like artificial intelligence can help us to live in a more sustainable way. So I am optimistic in the long term, even if I think we are facing some really significant problems. And I think I'm somewhat ashamed that we are the generation that is handing the baton to our children, and our children face undoubtedly a worse time. And that's not something that we've seen for the last couple of 100 years. Every generation has handed the baton on to the next generation, and it's been better. Quality of life has improved, and we're sadly placing our children in a worse situation, the planet and our children in a worse situation than the planet we found when we were born. So that's not a particularly very good record for us. So apologies to young people. But to go to your question, I do believe we need more regulation. And GDPR, despite those naysayers, and there were lots of naysayers before it came, there are lots of people actually who are very optimistic about it now and have actually said it's been very good. And I don't think it's bad that it's a somewhat viral regulation which has imposed GDPR-like rules upon us here in Australia, because that's given us freedoms that and privacies that were not regulated for, haven't been properly regulated for here. And it has been viral. You see in the United States, it's starting to have an impact. California now has its version of GDPR, and it's slowly taking over. And indeed, actually, I suspect that's how much good regulation of the digital space is going to happen. It's not going to happen because the United Nations or the World Economic Forum gets nations to agree. There's very little consensus amongst nations. It is this viral way that one or two nations take the lead. And at the moment, it seems to be largely Europe takes the lead and imposes regulations. And then in other places, they either impose similar regulations. So as an example, we now have a Google tax here in Australia. If Google doesn't pay a modicum of tax here on its operating profits, they will have to pay a percentage of their gross operating margins to us to force them not to engage in such aggressive accountancy maneuvers to avoid paying tax here. That was copied directly from the Google tax in the UK. So we will see, and that's why we saw when there was when Facebook withdrew their news feed. It feels like a year ago. Probably in the pandemic, it's hard to remember how long things were going. It feels like a lifetime ago, but it was about a year ago. And there was, Facebook was playing really, and Google were playing really hardball around those media rules that would be introduced at the time, because they realized not that it really mattered here. It was small change. It was tens of millions we're talking about. And Australia is a small market on the world stage. Absolutely. Because it set a precedent. And sure enough, similar rules were enacted in France shortly afterwards, and similar rules are now being applied in many other countries. So I think actually often the best and most appropriate and most successful place to regulate these things is going to be at the national level. There's going to be very little consensus we get. So I'm very happy to see more and more regulation happening. And indeed, I've got lots of friends who work in some of these tech companies, and having a beer with these people or a cup of coffee with these people, they will tell you in private that many of them will welcome regulation. That they say at the moment it is a wild west in many respects. And there's lots of things that those companies end up doing, not because they want to do them, but because they fear that their competitors are going to do them. And in many respects, we have to put a floor, and that's where governments have an important role. Markets need to be regulated. We have discovered that in the neoliberal economics of the last 20 or 30 years, that markets will run to excess, and markets are human institutions. They're defined by the rules that we as humans get to define, and they're up to us to define what those rules are so that they are aligned with the public good. And so I and many people working in the tech space welcome actually more regulation. That there's been a wonderful experiment for the last 20 or 30 years. We have brought wonderful innovation in the digital space with the invention of the internet and all of the things that have come with that have brought great productivity and bonuses to us. But equally, I think we're starting to see that there are some bad behavior starting to emerge, and that we need to actually shape where the market's going to go in future if we're going to ensure that it is aligning with the public good, and it's not completely aligning with the public good anymore.
Well, then finally, would you like to say a little bit about the work that you've done and led with constraints on lethal autonomous weapons? Because I find that a pretty chilling story as well.
It is a chilling story. I mean, this is one of the other things that does keep me awake at the night. And indeed, as we speak, the United Nations is discussing this very topic. And it's not a concern that I share, I alone have. It's a concern actually that the majority of my colleagues, other people working in artificial intelligence have, that we realize that it would cross a moral line to hand over killing to machines, to hand over the decision as to who lives and who dies to machines, because machines, despite all their smartness, lack certain things. They lack human empathy. They are not accountable. They can't be punished. There are lots of, they're not moral beings. And it would take us to a very dark place. And there are legal, ethical, moral reasons to worry that we would, if we handed over the decision as to who lives or who lives to machines, it would take the world to a very dangerous, dark place. And the interesting thing is we don't have to. There are many technologies we've decided that we shouldn't fight war with. We decided that with chemical weapons. We decided that with biological weapons, and a number of narrow, more specific technologies, like blinding lasers and cluster munitions. The history of the last 100 years is that we have decided that we've got plentiful means of deterrent and plentiful good ways of killing each other. There are some technologies that are just so distasteful that it would be better and safer if we decided to. I mean, first and foremost, the norm was that we don't use those technologies. And because one of the challenges is, how can you effectively regulate technologies, especially dual-use technologies like artificial intelligence, where the same technology, the same tracking algorithms are going to go into your autonomous car, is going to go into your autonomous missile. And the way that happens is by us deciding that it's not acceptable. That's how we decided chemical weapons were not going to turn up in the battlefield. We decided, we as a society, we were repulsed by their use in the First World War. And then it became the norm that you should use them. And of course, we haven't uninvented chemistry, just like we can't uninvent AI so that it could be used by bad actors. But chemical weapons aren't widely used, and they're definitely, and most importantly, they're not sold by arms companies. So they're not widely available. And when they do occasionally get used, there's outrage, there's headlines in newspapers around the world. There are sanctions imposed against the Russians, whoever it was. And that largely limits the misuse of chemical weapons, which has made the world a better place. And I think we could hope for the same if we decided that it was unacceptable, it was morally unacceptable to hand over killing to machines. And the majority of people, indeed, there have been international surveys done by Ipsos, shows the majority of people concur with this, that it would be repugnant to have machines deciding who lives and who dies. then we can hope to regulate them. We can hope that arms companies won't sell them, and that we can hope that sanctions will be opposed if they do get misused.
Well, thank you. Perhaps we should now turn to the questions from the audience. So thank you very much.
Yes.
Yes, perfect. There you are. Toby, there are a number of questions from the audience, so I'll get started. The first one is from Hugh Price. He says, Stuart Russell from UC Berkeley is giving the BBC Reith lectures this year. And the first one is called The Biggest Event in Human History. That suggests that he thinks the future of AI is not about privacy and identity, important as those might be in the short term. I know you share Stuart's concern about killer robots. Do you also share his sense of how big the impacts of AI are likely to be in the long term, for better or for worse?
Thank you, Hugh. It's nice to virtually connect with you online in this way. I do share Stuart's concerns and hopes in many respects. I think Stuart is hopeful that we will get it right. Stuart has a very nice way, a very nice metaphorical way of talking about this, which is, he said, imagine, and I think this is a good way to capture the scale of what we're looking at. Imagine if we received a message from deep space saying, hello, Earthlings, we are, an alien intelligence, and we plan to arrive in your solar system in 40 or 50 years' time, or 100 years' time. There would be chaos. I mean, there would be a meeting called at the United Nations to work out how do we respond to the potential threat or potential opportunity of clearly a much more intelligent species. Because if you've managed interstellar travel, you're obviously a much more intelligent species. The prospect of that species arriving on Earth. And yet we know, there's very good scientific consensus that that's going to happen. We know that a more intelligent species is due to arrive, and that's artificial intelligence. And it's going to happen, it's hard to predict exactly how long it's going to take. But that was the title of my book, 2062, was the median estimate when I surveyed 300 of my colleagues. It was somewhere in the next 50 or 100 years. That's likely the scale of the problem. It's not millennia away, probably, but it's equally, it's not going to happen in the next 5 or 10 years. It's something that's going to happen in our lifetimes, certainly in our children's lifetimes. And that should cause us a moment of concern, or at least a moment to stop and think, well, what is that? How is that going to change our lives? Because if we look around where we are today, if you look around the room that you're sitting in, everything you see in that room is the product of human intelligence. We got to be where we were on the planet by being not the fastest or the strongest animal on the savannah. We weren't any of those ever. We got there by being the smartest and using that intelligence, using tools, and we've used tools in the past to amplify our muscles. Well, here we face the promise of tools that can amplify our minds. And I think it would be terribly conceited to think that human intelligence was any limit. Human intelligence is just a point on the spectrum, a point on the scale. We were just smart enough. Evolution just made us smart enough to get where we were, and no smarter than that. And there are lots of biological limits to our intelligence. Interestingly enough, our brain uses a third of the body's energy, 20 or so of the 60 watts that your body generates. And that's the maximum we can possibly afford to give to that expensive organ. And that limits what you can do, but we have no such power limits on the computers. And certainly in the computers that we program today to do narrow tasks, they do them typically as soon as they get to be as good as humans, they get to be way better than humans because they have various natural advantages. So I do believe that machines will ultimately be far smarter than us. And with that offers us a great possibility to amplify all the things we do, to eliminate, eradicate diseases, to solve many of the challenging problems that face us. But equally, it's a profound change in our society that has to be managed properly to make sure that the benefits are shared around. And
I think it's worth looking back at history here. Looking back, for example, this is not the first big technological disruption that we've had of society. We went through a really significant one when we introduced agriculture, and a really significant one in the beginnings in the Industrial Revolution, when we started to introduce factories and steam engines and electricity that allowed us to leave the fields and lifted the quality and lifted the life expectancy of many of our lives. But it's worth realizing two important things about the Industrial Revolution that ensured that we had a positive outcome for society as a whole. Two things was, the one, there was significant periods of pain. It took 40 or 50 years before the quality of life of the average person improved. It went backwards for quite a way before it got better, and now it's much better. And secondly, it only improved because we made some really significant structural changes to society. We introduced unions to protect the rights of workers. We introduced labor laws to stop sending children down mines. We introduced universal education in most countries so that people were educated for their new jobs. We introduced a welfare state to protect people when they were out of work. We introduced universal pensions to protect people when they reached the end of their working life. So we made some really significant changes to the way we ran society to deal with the technological disruption, and to make sure that people like Marx were wrong, that the benefits weren't ended up just in the hands of the owners of the factories. So I think we face an equally challenging time now, and technology is not destiny. It's up to us to make the right choices as to how we move forwards, to deal with the promise as well as the threats that AI will be right. So I will agree with Stuart.
There's an interesting connection to the next question from Eddie Patterson. He says, are there forms of consensus that are becoming more difficult, since consensus is not formed by engagement and conversation, but by summarization of data? So is it more difficult?
Well, consensus is definitely more difficult. I think everywhere you look, you see society increasingly polarized. And increasing nationalism, increasing division within not just between nations, but within nations, between left and right, between many groups in society. We see a much greater polarization, and unfortunately, it's not hard to realize that technology is partly responsible. And I don't think it's solely responsible, but technology is partly responsible, and you only have to look at the political discussion going on in the United States to see some of that unfolding with the very valid criticisms being raised about social media companies like Facebook. And it is that we are living in these filter bubbles, that the common conversations that we used to have when we all watched the same television programs every evening, and we would share that common conversation is no longer happening, and with micro targeting of political advertising and of social media, we're seeing people being driven apart, and that's a very worrying trend. And I do think we need to put very strong regulation in place. And it's interesting. I mean, companies like Facebook will argue that they don't make a huge amount of money on political advertising, which is probably true. I mean, they make far more money advertising other products, and so if that's the case, I don't know why they don't actually realize that it's in their interest to not accept political advertising, and B, if they, irrespective of whether they decide it's in their own long-term interest, why we don't actually ban it. It's not adding anymore to our political conversations. There was a period where it was. I mean, there was the period of the time of the Arab Spring, and you saw, here was a technology that was giving voice to people. It was promoting democracy. It seemed to be a force for good at the time, but now we've seen that force for good being picked up by and used by wrong people in very destructive ways. And in that case, I think probably we should just say, okay, let's not have it. It's not helping our political discourse. Narrow casting these messages is not helping. If you've got something to say, of course, I'm fully for freedom of speech. Then maybe you should have to broadcast it to everyone, so everyone can see what lies or untruths you might be trying to peddle to people. And rather than, narrowcast different lies to different people.
Taking a slightly different point, this is Zahid Islam. He asks whether the notion of privacy is changing over time. And then he asks, could people be happy to sacrifice privacy depending on what they get in return?
Well, we've already made those sacrifices. That is already the case. We've already sacrificed your digital privacy. Any of those services that are free, you were sacrificing your digital privacy. And that information was being, despite what Facebook will say, that information is being sold to other people to try and persuade you to buy particular products or vote for particular people, and manipulate you in particular ways. So we've already done that trade. I don't buy the argument. I mean, Eric Schmidt, the retired CEO and chairman of Google, has said that privacy is a historical blip. That we didn't have privacy back in the Middle Ages when we were all living in much more communal settings, and it may be a temporary blip. I think privacy is a hard-fought right. It is part of our basic human rights, and it's incredibly important. It's incredibly important for change. If we think back to all the change that's happened, the fact that women got the vote, the fact that Aboriginal people were recognized in the society, it was because people got in the privacy of their homes to discuss ideas that were considered, in some cases, heretical at the time, unpopular or dangerous, and we got to think about those ideas in the privacy of our homes. And I think that is a great force for good, and we should not give up our privacy because. Don't take my word for it. I'm a technologist, but take the words of writers and visionaries like George Orwell and Aldous Huxley, and I think they've told us exactly what the world will look like if we do give up those privacies. And I feel a great responsibility as someone who's working on technologies that can amplify the way those privacies are taken away. That we roll those technologies out in ways that are helpful and not harmful.
And this is going to have to be our final question. It's quite a big one. It's from Brendan Hyde. He said, how likely is the singularity of computers making control decisions without human intervention? But how likely is it?
As a scientist, I have to tell you, it's not impossible. It's not a zero probability of event. It's certainly technically possible. There's nothing that we know about in the laws of physics that would prevent the singularity happen. Although I have written a paper which you can find on my website, which gives half a dozen reasons as to why the singularity might never be near. But it's something where we should have to entertain the possibility that it will happen. But I think we should keep it in respect in terms of there are much greater existential threats that face society today. The climate emergency, of course, fundamentally could destroy the fabric of our society in the next 50 or 100 years. And that is a very real threat. The notion of the singularity and computers taking over our society and destroying all of humanity, I think is a more distant and less likely threat. But I'm pleased to say that there are a plentiful number of my colleagues, people like Hugh Price, who asked one of the earlier questions, who are certainly thinking about these issues. And so, and I think that's all fit and good. Just if you go back, for example, to when the Manhattan Project happened and the physicists were about to set off the first nuclear explosion, they did the calculations, Oppenheimer and colleagues did the calculations to work out the probability that they were going to set light to the Earth's atmosphere and kill us all. And similarly, when they turned on the Large Hadron Collider in CERN, they did the calculations to work out the probability that they were going to construct a mini black hole that might consume the Earth, and see whether it was a negligible or a risk that needed to be addressed. And similarly, we have to consider this possibility that machines might become, way more intelligent than us, and we might see a real value alignment problem that we talked about value alignment earlier, which is that they might act in ways that is not good for human continuing existence. But interesting enough, we already know we have value alignment problem with computers. We see that in Facebook's newsfeed algorithm. We see that in computers where they're making decisions that are not aligned with, a good quality of political discourse. So we're already seeing the value alignment problem before we've even got to superintelligence. So we need to fix that way before we get to the value alignment of superintelligence. We need to fix the value alignment of stupid intelligence.
Look, I'm afraid I've got to the end of my time on my run sheet, Toby. There's another question from Seamus Miller about predictive policing, and I had about 10 more, but it's possibly best that they were left unasked. It's for me to thank you very much. It's really, I think, the first time I've shared a stage with a rock star. I had missed that one. Thanks for the admirable clarity and concision. I think it's so critical for us all that these issues are really widely debated, and your extraordinary ability to encapsulate complex ideas vividly for the non-specialist, I think is really important for us all as we begin to engage in these questions. So I do want to thank you very much. It's been great fun going through this. I will collect the next question and try and get it to you so that you can answer it. And I hand over to our president, Dr. Susan Pond, to close the meeting.
Thank you, Toby. Thank you, Christina, for a wonderful presentation and discussion. It's been very enjoyable and also pleasing to see the number of people who've stayed online. It's a great lead-in, Toby, to the forum that I mentioned, given the subject of your presentation. So in closing the meeting, formally, I remind you to put in your diaries this virtual conference on power and peril of the digital age, in which, as I mentioned, Toby will be featuring. And mark your diaries for the 4th and 5th of November from 9 to 12:30 p.m. for this virtual conference, where we will take a much deeper dive into some of the aspects that Toby has raised. He could probably give the whole conference in his own right, but we have many speakers who will join Toby in making an attempt to start to explore some of these issues. And the way we're going to explore it is by taking a child born on the day of the forum, on the 4th of November, through its digital life. And this is a child that's only going to be 9 in 2030 when we get to the Sustainable Development Goals. It will be 29 as it approaches 2050, and we anticipate that the child will live to 100, which will be in 2221, which is very difficult to say. So we're really going to try and project the future for this child in a complex age. And I look forward to seeing all of you at the forum. Thank you very much for attending tonight, and I formally close this meeting.